Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Religion in Wartime Community Forum. My name is Suzanne Simons, and I'm one of the faculty teaching the Religion and Society program that organized this event. This evening, we come together to explore how faith communities, specifically Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, think about issues of war, how they support members of their faith communities that may hold a wide variety of opinions about the U.S.-led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how clergy view their roles in wartime in their congregations and in the larger community. We also come together tonight to dialogue across differences, not only different religions, but also differences within religions, as represented by the two very different Christian communities on the panel. Religion has mixed with politics, economic systems, and social issues for as long as religions have been around. In the U.S., the original colonies were founded by particular religious communities: Puritan, Quaker, Anglican, etc. These religious communities shaped the nature of those early colonial governments. The Founding Fathers, who authored the U.S. Constitution, were mindful of the potential and the perils of religion. And so they did something radical. They founded a country with no official religion, leaving the door open for religious pluralism in which any religion could be practiced. Since then, faith communities have continued to be influential in U.S. politics and social issues. In the early 1800s, debates over slavery divided many Christian Protestants, leading to schisms in some major denominations in the decades leading up to the Civil War. So influential were faith communities in the slavery debate that Gary Wills, author of Head and Heart, asserts that, quote, "the Civil War was a religious war long before it was a military war," unquote. Many social and political movements since then have had a religious component. The best known is perhaps the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, in which African American churches, led by Dr. Martin Luther King and other clergy, along with their Jewish, white Christian, and secular allies, played leading roles. On a darker note, many American citizens, as well as legal U.S. residents who are Muslim, have been detained, questioned, arrested, and held in detention centers, sometimes indefinitely and without access to legal counsel or family support, post 9/11, by virtue of their religion and sometimes their race and ethnicity as well. Today, one of the major political and social issues of our times are the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Once again, faith communities are involved in the support, the questioning, or the protest of those wars, or omission of discussion and debate on the wars altogether. For tonight's program, the intent is to have a dialogue about religion and faith communities in wartime, to shed light on the differences as well as the similarities, to explore any common ground, and see if there is reason for continued dialogue by diverse faith communities around issues of war, and how to spiritually support those serving in the military and their families, those active in opposition to the wars, and those in between. The Religion and Society students have demonstrated all year in their good works in class and in their local faith communities where they have been doing service learning projects that it is possible to have this dialogue in a respectful, honest, and understanding way. It's also important to note who is absent from the speakers' table tonight. The Abrahamic faiths of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism lumped together represent well under half of the world's population. Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, and practitioners of other belief systems are not at the table tonight, partly because it is the Abrahamic faiths that, rightly or wrongly, are most frequently linked to the current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Also absent tonight is a chaplain currently serving in the U.S. military. For reasons that are not altogether clear, Joint Base Fort Lewis McChord officials decided late Monday afternoon not to allow Chaplain Mark Lee to speak at this forum. One housekeeping note: if you have not gotten a 3x5 note card tonight on which to write a question for the speakers and would like one, please raise your hand and students will come around and hand you a card. Or you can pick one up later. Later tonight, students will collect cards with your questions on them for a moderated question and answer session with the panelists and our keynote speaker. And now I'd like to turn the mic over to Michelle Anderson, a student in the Religion and Society program and member of the Planning Committee, who will introduce tonight's speakers and share a little about the Student Planning Committee. Thank you.
So first, I'd like to thank those who made this event possible: the President's Diversity Funds, the Evergreen Foundation, the Academic Deans, the Cultural Landscapes Program, and Common Bread Interfaith Group. I would also like to thank our professors, Stephen Beck and Suzanne Simons, for their continued support and guidance in planning this forum. But most of all, I would like to thank my fellow members of the Planning Committee. We have been working hard since last quarter, meeting every week to plan this forum. We continued throughout both quarters to engage one another and to engage our classmates, and the forum has come together better than we could have imagined. So Suzanne, Stephen, and the Planning Committee, please stand so that the audience can join me in thanking you properly. Our keynote speaker tonight is Captain James Yee. Captain Yee served as a Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo Bay, and after being accused of aiding alleged Taliban and al-Qaeda prisoners, he was arrested and held in solitary confinement for 76 days before being cleared of all charges. He is also the author of For God and Country, Faith and Patriotism Under Fire, and I'd like to read an excerpt from his introduction of his book. A military chaplain's role is to promote diversity, and that is a large part of what drew me to choose it as my career. I had always recognized the value of diversity. As a child, I was part of the only Chinese American family in a white middle-class suburb, but that didn't stop my parents from raising 5 happy children. In Damascus, I was one of the only few Westerners living in the city and studying at the school, but it didn't prevent me from achieving what I had set out to do. I knew that when I became a chaplain in the Army, I would be one of only a few Muslims, but that didn't mean I couldn't achieve great things. Instead, I believed these experiences would make me a better chaplain, truly committed to ensuring that the U.S. Army was a place where diversity was encouraged and honored, and where, above all else, people could practice their faith freely, regardless of the God they prayed to or the religion they professed. This is what being an American meant to me. We have copies of his book out there if anyone's interested. Next, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Seth Goldstein, who has served as the rabbi of Temple Beth Hatfilah in Olympia since 2003. He holds a Master's of Hebrew Letters and a Master's in Jewish Studies. Next, we have Fred LaMotte, who is a Quaker and the chaplain of Evergreen's interfaith student group Common Bread. He also teaches world religions, philosophy, and biblical studies to deployed soldiers through distance learning. And lastly, we have Pastor Cyndi Pollard, who serves as Associate Pastor and Principal at Evergreen Christian School in Olympia. So I'm going to turn it over to Captain James Yee.
Thank you very much. I guess first I'll just begin real quickly by first thanking the school, the students, and all of those who were instrumental in inviting me here to participate in this program and to be amongst this great lineup of speakers. And I'm looking forward to the discussion that we'll all have afterwards. I guess I can start a little bit more also with more of my background, so you have an idea of some of the perspectives that I might share with you. But you heard in the introduction, I'm a former military soldier, former officer, former chaplain of the United States Army. I'm a graduate of West Point. I graduated from the United States Military Academy. And not only am I myself former military, but I actually come from a military family. These are my brothers and my father. My younger brother, as you see on the left, also graduated West Point. My other brother on the far right, he's an Army doctor, currently serving on active duty at Fort Hood. Fort Hood in the state of Texas, where that tragic shooting happened or occurred just recently in November. My brother's a doctor at the medical facility where the individual involved in that situation also worked. And my father also was in the U.S. Army. He was drafted during World War II. My father, also a U.S.-born citizen, was drafted during World War II and actually served part of his time here in Washington State. So I come from a military family. So the military culture now is rather rooted in my family, and the service that all of us have contributed to the U.S. military is something we're all proud of, and I actually find benefit. I gained benefit from going to the military academy and learning skills of leadership. But not only in my former military, I'm a Muslim convert, and most people know me today as a Muslim because I was the Muslim chaplain, but I was raised Lutheran. I didn't convert to Islam until my early adult years, and I converted from Lutheran. And here's a picture of when I was confirmed in the 8th grade. I'm there in the front row, the long hair there with the glasses. Okay. So I also bring to the table, my background, my experience being raised as a Christian. When we look at the program that we have here today, Religion and Society, and the role that religion or religious clergy play in hopefully fostering peace, it's a very interesting idea, because when we look at history, sometimes the role of religious people maybe didn't foster peace. Maybe it was just the opposite. And when we look at, for example, when the Crusade started, the Pope at that time, who called for the first crusade, in 1095, he was someone who went out and pledged remittance of sins for those who would participate and go and fight. The first crusade, of course, the goal was to reconquer the Holy Lands and Jerusalem from Muslim rule at the time. But the first crusade, and the Pope who called for it wasn't the only one. Other popes as well. Pope Innocent III called for the Fourth Crusade, also known as the Catholic Crusade. And the goal there was also to, again, conquer Muslim-controlled Jerusalem by means of invading through Egypt, through Cairo, which at that time was the center of the Muslim world, to go directly to the heart of the Muslim nation there. And he also promised remission of sins and guaranteed a place in heaven for those who would participate in the crusade. And of course, historically, we know a lot of the atrocities that occurred during those wars. But even in my own religion, when we look at other aspects of history of Islam, for example, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was a Muslim scholar who had a very strict, stringent, orthodox view of religion. And he would partner with the Saudi king at that time, King Abdullah Aziz ibn Saud. And his idea of Islam was advocating for a process to purify Islam from what he called innovations, doing things that the Prophet Muhammad himself didn't do. Innovation. So if you did something that the Prophet didn't do, then that was called an innovation, and therefore, if you did that, you could be considered a non-believer. And if you were a non-believer, then there would be justified reason for you to be attacked or even killed. He would partner with the Saudi king in the 18th century, and that led to Ibn Saud leading perhaps up to 140 years of military campaigns that would have military troops occupy, for example, the city of Taif and also the city of Mecca. It would lead to armies massacring unarmed Muslims. It would lead to destruction of graves. Sheikh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab thought that the graves was a threat to worship, that people might start worshiping the graves or worshiping the pious people who were in those graves, and therefore corrupting their belief in Islam. So it led to the massacre of graves and holy sites, right? So this happened under Muslim scholarship, justifying things which would normally be considered, outrageous. And perhaps even more recent conflicts, like we saw or recently heard when former President George Bush, when it was revealed that one of the things that he told the Palestinian Prime Minister about going to war, that God would, he was quoted saying, God would tell me, George, go and fight those terrorists in Afghanistan, right? And then God would tell me, George, go and end the tyranny in Iraq. And I did. So, the president back there was indicating that he was inspired by God to go to war. Right? But other religious clergy and other religious people have participated during times of war in other capacities, specifically chaplains. I was a military chaplain. I was hoping that we would have had a military chaplain here today. I'd heard that the chaplain from Fort Lewis had been invited, and it would have been very interesting to hear his comments. And I was hoping he would be able to have, he or she would have been able to shed some light more about the role that chaplains play in the military, allowing me to talk about some of the other things. But chaplains in the military, and the example or the precedence of chaplains who have served during wartime, specifically with prisoners of war, relates directly to my own personal experience when I was assigned to be the Muslim chaplain down in Guantanamo Bay. But from the very early stages of our American history, World War II, a chaplain named Joseph Logren, he ministered to 2,000 German and Austrian prisoners who were detained in central Siberia. You see here Army Chaplain Henry Grecki. He, along with another chaplain named Sixtus O'Connor, who was a Catholic priest, Chaplain Grecki was a Lutheran minister. They ministered to the war criminals during the Nuremberg trial. So they were directly ministering to those who were convicted of war crimes and were sent to death. So there was precedence for chaplains in our U.S. military to minister to prisoners of war or people who were considered the enemy. And I relay that because I was sent to Guantanamo as a chaplain to the prisoners who were held in that prison camp. And that was back in 2003, late 2002, when there were about 660 or so alleged terrorists, Muslim terrorists, who were being held in this now infamous prison detention center. Today, there are still about 185 still there, and Guantanamo continues to be an issue that I follow very closely, and I'll touch more about Guantanamo. But chaplains have served in the military in other capacities. One of the roles specifically is ministering to prisoners who have been captured by our forces. The other role, though, that I'll mention about chaplains who serve within the military, since we don't have our chaplain here, is that our service to in the military is based on the constitutional right to religious freedom. If you think about our society, living in a society that has separation of church and state, you might ask, how is it that clergy people, chaplains of different denominations, Christian, Jewish, Islam, and other representatives of other faiths in the military can serve as religious people? Taxpayer dollars pay for the salaries of those chaplains who serve within our ranks. How is that so in a society that has separation of church and state? Well, what gives, or what has been, what's the reason for the legitimacy of chaplains who serve in the ranks is their primary role to defend religious freedom. to accommodate religious practices of those who serve the military. And that role of the chaplain to defend religious freedom not only goes to those who serve within the military, the service members and all of the armed forces, but it also is defending the religious rights and advocating for accommodations for the civilians who may be employed on a religious institution or installation. Okay. As well as it also goes to any prisoners, any individuals who may be incarcerated or imprisoned by our U.S. Army forces. And in Guantanamo, that is exactly the case that we see today. And when I went down to Guantanamo, I recognized, first and foremost, my role as a chaplain was to advocate for accommodations of religious practices and to ensure that their religious rights were being protected and met. I want to tell you a story about something that happened in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the tragic attacks on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon. The United 93 flight also went down in Pennsylvania. One of the things that President George Bush did after 9/11 was to summon about 30 religious leaders from across the nation, of different denominations, all faiths. Of those 30, about 8 of them actually had private one-on-one meetings with the president himself. Okay. This picture is taken of that meeting with some of the religious leaders. It was on September 20th. It was the same day that President Bush called for a joint session of the two Congresses to address the attacks of 9/11. That was on September 20th, 2001. But before that, he met with the religious leaders. One of those particular religious leaders is a prominent member, or that was called to the White House, is a prominent member of the American Muslim community known as Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And he's in California. He's head of this organization called the Zaytuna Institute. He's a prominent, recognized American Muslim scholar, traditional American Muslim scholar here in the U.S. He was one of those leaders, and he's in that picture there. You can see him he's the second person to the left of President Bush there. And I heard him tell his story about when he was summoned to the White House. And he talked about when he met with the president, 3 things that he did. And one was he gave the president a copy of the Quran. It's entitled The Essential Quran, the Thomas Cleary translation of the Quran, with some verses pointed out or highlighted for the president to read. The second thing he did was he gave the president a piece of artwork that was made by a Muslim American calligrapher named Muhammad Zakaria. Now, Muhammad Zakaria is the American Muslim who designed the Islamic Eid stamp, the postage stamp that commemorates the Islamic holidays. It's blue and it has some Arabic calligraphy on it. He designed that. And Sheikh Hamza Yusuf gave to the president this piece of artwork that Muhammad Zakaria was making at the time of the attacks. At the exact time of the attacks, Muhammad Zakaria was crafting this piece of artwork. He was writing a script from a well-known seerah or biography of the Prophet Muhammad, and he was writing the words, and I'll give you the translation. The Prophet Muhammad never returned an evil with another evil. Instead, he forgave. These were the words that Muhammad Zakaria was writing at the time of the 9/11 attacks. And when he finished that piece of artwork, he gave it to Sheikh Hamza Yusuf to give to the president. The third thing that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf talked about when he visited the president was discussing with the president his intention to call the upcoming military operation in Afghanistan Operation Infinite Justice. We know it today as Operation Enduring Freedom, but initially it was supposed to be called Operation infinite justice. Right. But Sheikh Hamza Yusuf pointed out to the president that this would be a name that would be disrespectful, or it would be offensive to Muslims all over the world, and perhaps individuals of other faith who believe in God. Because it's the view of many religious people that the only one that is infinitely just is God, the Almighty Himself. And to call the Operation Infinite Justice would be saying to the world, would be saying specifically to the Muslim world where our troops would be deploying, that America is infinitely just. Perhaps America really is God. And that would be offensive to all. That was something that swayed the president to have the name of this operation changed, and as we know today, now it's called Operation Enduring Freedom. And I share with you because I thought that was very interesting in the role that this American Muslim leader played in the immediate 9/11 aftermath in his interaction with President Bush. Today also there's another prominent member of the Muslim community. Although he's not particularly someone of the religious clergy, he's an attorney. He's a graduate of the Yale Law School. He's a graduate of Harvard undergrad in Middle Eastern Studies. He is a White House Deputy Associate Counsel to President Obama. He's also has been recently appointed as the Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Conference. One of the things that he did prior to gaining these roles was with the Brookings Institute, a think tank, he authored a paper called Reformulating the Battle of Ideas, Understanding the Role of Islam in Counterterrorism Policy, in which he came up with some ideas. He suggested terminology, words to use, which would be non-offensive in a similar role or similar guidance or piece of advice that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf gave to the president. Today, he is at the right hand of the president, or perhaps very close to the president's inner circle, advising him on matters of religion, matters of the Middle East, matters of the Muslim world. And hopefully, someone like this, an individual like this, who is also very prominent in our community, is making positive contributions. It's also interesting to note that though this, as I mentioned, this person is not a member of the clergy, he himself is what's known as a hafiz of Quran, meaning he's someone who has memorized word for word the entire Quran, according to the traditions of Islam. Another way that the American Muslim community has been involved, especially since 9/11, in hopefully trying to foster peace and foster a regrowth of values in our nation, is trying to promote the idea of anti-torture. Many of the prominent American Muslim organizations in this country, like ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, ICNA, the Islamic Circle of North America, the Islamic Shura Council in Southern California, which is a conglomeration of a majority of the Islamic centers and mosques in that area, Mass Freedom Foundation, the American Muslim Society, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. The prominent American Muslim organizations that I've named are part of what's known as the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. Now, the National Religious Campaign of Torture has a plethora of religious organizations who have signed on to advocate that our country reestablishes itself with morals, that we advocate against torture, abusing prisoners who may be in the custody of our U.S. military. And they lobby, they organize, they educate, they provide worship resources like interfaith prayer and workshops. They sponsor events to advocate for the banning of torture and whatnot. It's a unified effort of many religious organizations, religious clergy people, for a common goal that pretty much all religions advocate, and that's being humane to our fellow brothers in society. Many of our prominent American Muslim organizations are part of this movement. I believe this organization is really a great example of interfaith work, interfaith movement, and providing a unified effort to move ahead together to accomplish those ideals and values that are common between religions, especially the Abrahamic faiths. Right here in Olympia, Washington, for example, I can point to a particular interfaith type movement that the Muslim and our Jewish community here are involved in. It's called the Listening or Compassionate Listening Group, and our rabbi can perhaps shed maybe more light on some of that, since it's his organization that is in conjunction or cooperation with the Muslim community here. And we've met and gotten together on many occasions, especially when we see tension and turmoil in the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and when things get out of hand over there, to discuss, our views, our feelings about what's going on. But there are many other interfaith movements that are occurring all around the country, and that's, in my view, a great pathway to knowing each other, understanding each other, in hopes of fostering mutual understanding and peace. Guantanamo Bay. So when I talk about anti-torture, of course, this is something that I'm very passionate about, because when I served down in Guantanamo Bay as the Muslim chaplain, going down to advocate for religious freedom, to advocate for religious accommodations, another issue came into play, and that was the abuse and mistreatment of prisoners down at Guantanamo. But there were other things that I was very concerned about when I was there, not only the human rights abuses, but the rule of law, which I saw being trumped. President Bush had said Geneva Conventions don't apply down in Guantanamo. Most legal experts, especially in the realm of human rights today, call Guantanamo a legal black hole, where the prisoners there seemingly don't have full rights as individuals, as human beings. And a lot of litigation has already gone through our court system all the way to the Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court has already ruled 3 times against the past administration with regard to rights afforded to prisoners in Guantanamo. But there are other issues, medical ethics violations from medical personnel who work down in Guantanamo, religious persecutions, which I'm going to touch, which I might touch upon a little more, and even child prisoners who were down in Guantanamo, were things that I myself saw as things not good for America. In terms of religious persecution, this was really disturbing to me, because I was there serving as a military chaplain. I was there with the goal of protecting religious rights, but instead it was the desecration of the Holy Quran that was happening in some of the interrogation rooms, in the cell blocks, maybe at times by guards, sexual humiliation, where the exploitation of Muslim culture, separation between the sexes, male and female, were exploited by interrogators. The use of satanic symbols to persecute Muslims, because it was recognized that Muslims in Guantanamo held strongly to the belief in one God. There were other incidences like the beard being forcibly shaving for Muslims, because U.S. personnel knew down in Guantanamo that some Muslims, very conservative, orthodox Muslims, may sometimes consider having a beard as an obligation upon a pious man. Right? There were incidences that I learned later that I didn't even know about that occurred in Guantanamo, that I read about later, like what I have here, forced baptisms by interrogators who would dress up as priests. They would take a Muslim, they knew a prisoner who knew they knew he was Muslim. In the interrogation room, in would come a person who was dressed up like a Catholic priest, and he would go to that Muslim prisoner and perform this like baptism ceremony on him, saying, "I've just baptized you into our Christian faith." And of course, that was something that would outrage that individual who was sitting in that chair, chained and shackled. Right? There were other things like prayers being mocked or interrupted while they were conducted in the prison cell block. So these types of religious persecutions were things that were occurring in Guantanamo, things that I myself would raise to the chain of command. And in doing so, of course, that led to a whole different experience for me, being then accused of being too sympathetic to the prisoners, even having had aided the enemy, then thrown in prison myself and persecuted as someone of an ethnic and religious minority in my own country. But today, one of the things that I do on a regular basis is to try and raise awareness of this issue that I'm very passionate about. And this is one of the ways in which I hope that I am making a positive contribution towards fostering peace and moral values in our nation. Again, it's a pleasure to give my comments, to share my thoughts, and I look forward to meeting people after the program as well. Again, my name is Chaplain James Yee, and again, thanks for having me.
The Q&A, the questions that are raised, we really have this dialogue. But I wanted to share first just reading a passage from my tradition, from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Isaiah, which is might be familiar to you, although I'll read it in Hebrew first, which might not be familiar, but you can pretend, I guess. It's v'chitatu charvotam le'itim v'chinotatehem lemazmerot lo yisagoy al goy cherev lo yimudu od milchama, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation; they shall never again know war. Which it's this famous passage about beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, taking the tools of war and making them into something more productive. But then I want to jump to the book of Joel, Prophet Yoel, in chapter 4, and this is chapter 2 of Isaiah. And here, this prophet reads, "Kotu eitechem lecharavot, ve'mezmarotechem lerimachem, ve'chalash yomer gibor ani." Let all the fighters come and draw near, beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears, and even the weaklings say, "I am strong." So it's fascinating looking at these two passages right next to each other. The famous from Isaiah, promoting this idea of peace, of beating the plowshares into swords into plowshares, and then reading the prophet Yoel, prophet Joel, talking about beating plowshares into swords, the complete opposite. And reading these two passages together, it is striking because it raises for me the question, well, what is, in relation to war, especially in this case, but in religion in general, what is religion all about? That religion, for me, on the one hand, is meant to describe or relate to life as it is. Relate to life as it is, and that life, and to present life that we know it in a context and add meaning to it and to add some order to the chaos. And life as it is, as we know, is quite messy and challenging and incorporates not just the good but the bad, and not just those plowshares but also the swords. Another teaching from our tradition related to this as well, it relates to one of our practices, which is the holiday of Hanukkah, which is a pretty popular holiday that you might be familiar with, and happens in the winter time. And the story of Hanukkah we find from the book of Maccabees, which actually isn't even in the Hebrew Bible, it's in the Apocrypha in our canon. And it's a story of rededication of an ancient temple in 165 BCE, in the hands of the Maccabees, overthrowing the Syrian Greek occupiers at that time. And it's a fascinating holiday. It's a very nuanced holiday. It's a very fun holiday for kids, and it gets played up. We light the menorah, we light the candle for 8 days. But looking at the layers around this holiday, that looking at the book of Maccabees, what this holiday is all about is essentially a military victory. It's marking a military victory. It's a violent reclaiming of of territory, of land. And yet holding that essence of the holiday, and then looking at later Jewish tradition related to the holiday of Hanukkah, especially in the Talmud, which is our ancient teachings, follows the Bible. It's the next major aspect of the Jewish canon following the Bible, that there's a great discomfort with the ancient rabbis in that text with this story of Hanukkah. In fact, so much so that they recreate or rewrite a new story to tell the reason behind Hanukkah. And it relates to this finding of a cruse of oil that's then burned for 8 days, even though it only had enough oil for one. And so here we see, in another aspect of the tradition, one on the one hand with the two prophets, Isaiah and Joel, showing this tension that we have in life and religion as it is. Here we have with the story of Hanukkah and the multiple stories of Hanukkah with this discomfort with this essence of militarism in our tradition. Related to this other aspect of religion that I think about is that religion not only tells us about what life is and helps us to give a context to what life is, but also tries to teach us about life as it could be, and what life is meant to be, and how we can transcend the life that is into something more than or greater and reaching values. And so relating to this notion of war, of violence, that on the one hand we see with these prophets that war is in many ways a reality of life, and we see it, and it continues through our day, hasn't changed. But yet we are meant to work as hard as we can to transcend that reality and reach towards peace. As in the other words of Isaiah, Bakesh shalom veradfehu, that you shall seek peace and pursue it. That we have this aspect of our lives, and yet we are meant to transcend that. We face the realities of war, but must always be working towards peace. The Jewish legal tradition throughout the course of our teachings deals with the issue of war on multiple levels. It's the Jewish textual tradition is very much a legal tradition dealing with laws and practices. That's how we organize our religious life, around various practices, not only around ritual aspects, but the Jewish legal tradition involves itself also with civil matters, and in this case, issues of war. War is related in the Torah, in our sacred teachings. And so the textual tradition deals with this, but in very fascinating ways, related almost to the same issue with the story of Hanukkah, that there's a great discomfort with the issue of war as it appears in the Torah, in the Tanakh, and a lot of arguing to try and argue it out of existence, and thinking about developing elaborate rules of war, about when one can go to war and how one can go to war and who can't go to war and who can go to war. In this idea with betraying this great discomfort that the ancient rabbis had with these ancient texts. And to the fascinating degree, because in understanding the Jewish textual tradition, this conversation is really purely theoretical, because there is no context for this, because for most of Jewish tradition, Jewish community did not have power or political power to enact wars or to enact any of these rules or regulations that the rabbis are coming up with. So it's this interesting tension in that it's a topic of conversation, but yet in a purely theoretical plane, and that conversation steers us away towards the realities of war, more towards the granting of peace. And I take that understanding of those ancient rabbis when we approach this issue in our own day. And in thinking about religion and religion's a response to war, coming from my tradition, I think that we're going to find somewhat similarities, because even in Chaplain Yee's presentation, especially the conclusions, I see the dreads of similarities, that facing this reality and trying to overcome it and transcend it is, I think, the role of religion. And I see that working on 3 different levels, and from my experience. And I have to admit, I have limited experience, at least with these wars. It's on a more theoretical level. I don't have that many people in my community, in my congregation, who directly affected, either through military service. And I think that gets to the larger scenario in which, at least within the Jewish community, Jews are a religious minority in this country and also a religious minority in the military. Although I have contact with colleagues of mine who are military chaplains, and I hear a lot of their stories about serving the Jews who are serving in the military in various places and the variety of holiday services, and hearing about their specific needs. And so that leads to the first, and I think that on the first level, a religious obligation in wartime is to simply care for those who are affected by it in a very non-judgmental way. I think that that's part of the pastoral response that religions have to provide. People are affected by war, serve in the military, or families of people who serve in the military and have realities and needs based around that, and trying to meet those needs is a religious response. We saw in the presentation that it's not just about those fighting wars, those who are affected by wars, prisoners of war as well, that everybody affected by war has deeply personal needs, and part of the religious response is to meet those. The second is to work towards peace, and that sounds sort of broad, but I think in some of the ways that we're spoken of speaking out, of raising awareness, of seeing how war affects us in destructive ways, and trying to overcome war and to speak out against war and to find real ways of seeking the peace. And that mantra of peace that is inherent within religious tradition, inherent within Jewish tradition, is one that has to be repeated. And working in a variety of ways, it's interesting that the issue of torture came up, because one of the organizations that I'm affiliated with, called Rabbis for Human Rights, has, at least Rabbis for Human Rights North America, has as one of its major campaigns against torture, based on what's happening in the past several years in our country. And I think that the third response that religion brings within wartime is especially in these contemporary situations in which religion plays a part in these wars, whether appropriately or not. I think that religion has to bring a positive view of religion. And in many ways, what we see happening is that people carrying out destructive acts in the name of religion. And we see that all the time. And I think that part of the religious response to those acts is to speak out from the religious perspective, and not to demonize or put forth religion, which is a common response, and we see that all the time, that, well, religion, people do things in the name of, people do destructive acts in the name of religion, and therefore religion is without value, or lacks morality, or is misguided. And I think that's misguided, or else I'm in the wrong business. But I think that therefore the role of religion is to be part of that conversation, and to see that where people act in certain ways in the name of religion is not necessarily representation, or the single representation of that religion, if not a distortion of that religion. And so those three, the personal needs, the sort of more meta or global issues about speaking towards peace, but then also speaking about what it means to be coming from a religious perspective, I think are important responses in wartime from religion. And it happens on multiple levels, and in many ways, as we do in all of our lives, so much has to do on that personal connection. I mean, I feel moved already just coming on this panel and hearing this presentation, and my perspective has been broadened in another way. And I think that it's that interaction. I hope we all move away from this panel moved in some way, because it's in that interaction. And as Chaplain, you mentioned here in Olympia, since you said I would speak about it, I guess I should speak about it, that we have going on here in Olympia, at least within our communities, between the Jewish and the Muslim communities, finding opportunity in the challenge. And I think that is key, that when we have, one of the questions that were asked, how does war affect interfaith cooperation? On the one hand, it strains it, especially depending on the context of war. and the players in the context of the war, there's a possibility of straining that, but also a tremendous opportunity to draw together and to transcend, getting in that the third aspect of what is at the heart of our religions. Where can we find that common ground? And that's involved in conversing and meeting and sharing. That's something that the Jewish and the Muslim communities have been doing in this community for several years now, and will continue. It's a conversation that has to be broadened among all of us. So that, I'm over time, right? Am I? That's not good? Okay, I was going to end with, I can maybe bring it later, but a quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who spoke very powerful words against war that you'll take my word for, because I'm not going to read them. But I'll read later. But it was fascinating. I was reading this piece, and he was talking about the war. The title was "The Meaning of This War," and the war he's talking about is World War II. And as you know, within World War II, the events of the Holocaust, very destructive to the Jewish community, that were personally affected to Rabbi Heschel. And to hear him speak against war in such a powerful way and at such a powerful time is very inspiring. We can take that away, that even when we're challenged in that personally, to be able to transcend those issues of war and seek the peace, I think is what we are all called upon to do. So, thank you.
Hand you a card. Or you can pick one up later. Later tonight, students will collect cards with your questions on them for a moderated question and answer session with the panelists and our keynote speaker. And now I'd like to turn the mic over to Michelle Anderson, a student in the Religion and Society program and member of the Planning Committee, who will introduce tonight's speakers and share a little about the Student Planning Committee. Thank you.
So first, I'd like to thank those who made this event possible, the President's Diversity Funds, the Evergreen Foundation, the academic deans, the Cultural Landscapes Program, and Common Bread Interfaith Group. I would also like to thank our professors, Stephen Beck and Suzanne Simons, for their continued support and guidance in planning this forum. But most of all, I would like to thank my fellow members of the Planning Committee. We have been working hard since last quarter, meeting every week to plan this forum. We continued throughout both quarters to engage one another and to engage our classmates, and the forum has come together better than we could have imagined. So, Suzanne...
Colonial governments. The Founding Fathers, who authored the U.S. Constitution, were mindful of the potential and the perils of religion. And so they did something radical. They founded a country with no official religion, leaving the door open for religious pluralism in which any religion could be practiced. Since then, faith communities have continued to be influential in U.S. politics and social issues. In the early 1800s, debates over slavery divided many Christian Protestants, leading to schisms in some major denominations in the decades leading up to the Civil War. So influential were faith communities in the slavery debate that Gary Wills, author of Head and Heart, asserts that, quote, the Civil War was a religious war long before it was a military war, unquote. Many social and political movements since then have had a religious component. The best known is perhaps the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, in which African American churches, led by Dr. Martin Luther King and other clergy, along with their Jewish, white Christian, and secular allies, played leading roles. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Religion in Wartime Community Forum. My name is Suzanne Simons, and I'm one of the faculty teaching the Religion and Society program that organized this event. This evening, we come together to explore how faith communities, specifically Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, think about issues of war, how they support members of their faith communities that may hold a wide variety of opinions about the U.S.-led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how clergy view their roles in wartime in their congregations, and in the larger community. We also come together tonight to dialogue across differences. Not only different religions, but also differences within religions, as represented by the two very different Christian communities on the panel. Religion has mixed with politics, economic systems, and social issues for as long as religions have been around. In the U.S., the original colonies were founded by particular religious communities: Puritan, Quaker, Anglican, etc. These religious communities shaped the nature of those early communities where they have been doing service learning projects, that it is possible to have this dialogue in a respectful, honest, and understanding way. It's also important to note who is absent from the speakers' table tonight. The Abrahamic faiths of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism lumped together represent well under half of the world's population. Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, and practitioners of other belief systems are not at the table tonight, partly because it is the Abrahamic faiths that, rightly or wrongly, are most frequently linked to the current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Also absent tonight is a chaplain currently serving in the U.S. military. For reasons that are not altogether clear, Joint Base Fort Lewis-McChord officials decided late Monday afternoon not to allow Chaplain Mark Lee to speak at this forum. One housekeeping note: if you have not gotten a 3x5 note card tonight on which to write a question for the speakers and would like one, please raise your hand and students will come around and... On a darker note, many American citizens, as well as legal U.S. residents who are Muslim, have been detained, questioned, arrested, and held in detention centers, sometimes indefinitely and without access to legal counsel or family support, post 9/11, by virtue of their religion and sometimes their race and ethnicity as well. Today, one of the major political and social issues of our times are the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Once again, faith communities are involved in the support, the questioning, or the protest of those wars, or omission of discussion and debate on the wars altogether. For tonight's program, the intent is to have a dialogue about religion and faith communities in wartime, to shed light on the differences as well as the similarities, to explore any common ground, and see if there is reason for continued dialogue by diverse faith communities around issues of war, and how to spiritually support those serving in the military and their families, those active in opposition to the wars, and those in between. The religion and society students have demonstrated all year in their good works in class and in their local faith community